I'm here to talk about the argument that exists between people that say you can't tell the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, and the very same related argument that talks about not being able to tell the difference between 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. If you don't feel like watching, the general conclusion is you can't see less than 30 frames per second. Wait, am I phrasing that right? You can't tell the difference between 30 and 60. You can't tell the difference between 60 and 20 in theory. Now, in reality, the situation's a bit different. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over how that works, why that works, and all that other stuff. I'm going to use really crude, as you can see, paint art to depict that. And I'm going to use lines that designate 1 second. Ooh, maybe I should have practiced with paint before doing this. Okay. Anyway, so this line is 1 second. All right. And let's say we're going to talk about, 30 frames per second. Okay. Now, 30 frames per second, like when you're recording with Fraps or you have your in-game FPS toggled on, you'll notice it jumps around a lot because the frames per second is an average, right? It takes the average of the frames that were captured or that were rendered in that second and displays that average. And it calculates it faster than a second. So, okay, that's cool, right? We can all agree on that, right? Our frames per second is an average. So average frames per second. So if this is 30, FPS, let's go back to our line. And we have an average of 30 frames over this 1 second line. Okay. Now, in the interest of not making this completely clustered, let's say that each one of these lines is 5 frames, right? So there's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and then way over here, 30. Okay, now the people that argue that they can tell the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second are seeing this. Notice how there's this big gap right here, right? Let's put a different color. This big gap right here. Now, that's what we call frame rate tanking, right? When like people that are playing games say, oh, well, the frame rate tanks. Well, that's because there's these gaps right here that you can see. Because keep in mind, the 30 frames per second is an average. That's an average over the whole second. As you can see, we have our 30 frames in segments of 5 over the entire second. But just because that's an average doesn't mean that they're evenly spaced out. Now, of course, games try to make this as evenly spaced out as possible. But because of all the physics involved, and because nothing is a perfect science, that's not what happens. So you see these gaps right here. Now let's break this line down even farther, right? So let's say we have this little bracket right here, this little bracket right here, and then this little bracket right here. Because we notice like your Fraps or whatever you use update faster than 1 second, right? So this is 30 frames per second. This is 30 frames per second. And then let's make another one real quick. Let's say this one right here. This one right here is like, 37 frames per second. And then this one over here, obviously, it drops to like 20 FPS right here. Now this all happens in the course of a second. Okay, so over this 1 second, we have 30 frames per second. But as you can see, because it's an average, which I know these numbers don't add up, this is just a conceptual thing. Okay, that disclaimer's out of the way. This is all conceptual. As you can see, at some points it's going to go higher. Maybe you were looking at your feet for, this brief part of the second, and then you scrolled up and tried to look at another player that was running, and it tanked because, the game wasn't properly optimized, or whatever catchphrase you want to use. And this is where you see the difference, and is where you say, well, 30 frames per second sucks because of this part of the second right here, where I noticed an obvious stutter. Okay, so let's take a moment and go back into conceptualization. Okay, let's draw another line, and let's call this 60 frames per second. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing with the lines, except this time, instead of the lines being 5, let's make them 10, right? So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Now, as you can see, these aren't perfectly spaced out because I'm doing this in Paint real quick, but it's much more consistent. And what I was going for is a rough average. Now you have these 60 frames per second all set out nice and even. So there's no, or at least I tried to make it where there's none of this big green ugliness right here, where the tank rate crashes, where the frame rate just slows way down. And so you're playing one game on one computer at 30 frames per second, and you're like, man, this sucks. Like, you can tell there's obvious skippage right here. And then you play on another computer, you know, you go back home or whatever, and you're playing on your computer and you're getting 60 frames per second, and it's nice and smooth. And you're like, man, dude, you can obviously tell the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. Makes sense, right? How you could, like, think like this? That's what I'm asking, what makes sense, right? It makes sense to where you can watch 30 frames per second where it tanks and 60 frames per second where it doesn't tank and think that you notice a difference. But once again, all this is happening in the space of 1 second. And this just so happens to not tank, right? So good for 60 frames per second in this small example. And then we can do another line real quick, just because, you know, we're doing lines, of 120 frames per second. All right, so this time each line will be 20. So 20, 40, 60, 80, oh, oops, 100, and 120, right? And we'll call this 120. And same thing, right? Now, because I'm just using these big block lines, you know, we can make like little smaller lines real quick. You can see that because you're fitting all these frames in that 1 second, if your computer can do it, and if there's no tank rate crashing, it's a lot smoother because you're cramming all those frames into the same second, right? In fact, let's just make it even more obvious, right? Because you just have all these frames crammed into that 1 second. Obviously, you cannot tell, you know, everything is as smooth as the game creator made it. And then these are, once again, big lines, because it's all evenly spaced out. So then you ask yourself, well, not many people are so bold as to say they can tell the difference between 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. But there are some people that make that claim. But because it works the same exact way, I'm just going to focus on the 30 frames and the 60 frames. So 30 frames per second, you can see, is all messed up. But there's a problem with this picture, right? There's a big problem with it. And what's the problem? Is that we show the 30 frames per second performing worse than the 60 frames per second. That's no bueno, right? Because that's not what happens. That happens in some poorly optimized games that, or, you know, if you're using a much better computer for the 60 frames per second, and, you know, or you watch like all these different gameplay videos where, you know, they have badass computers already, computers that I definitely do not have. So this is the concept behind it. We see the stutter because there's not as many frames. It's averaged out, and then there's spots where it sinks. And once it gets below 30 frames per second, in fact, once it gets below 24 frames per second, you can tell, your eyes can tell easily. Okay, and this is in a more lit game, in a brighter game, like let's say BioShock Infinite compared to the original BioShock, which was pretty dark, I'm sorry. So BioShock Infinite's really bright, which means it's harder to see the tanking. Whereas in a dark game, it's easier to see the tanking. I don't know why that is. It has something to do with how your eyes register light, right? They register light a lot better than you register darkness. Like, for instance, if you're in like a really well-lit room and there was a flash of dark, there's a less chance of you noticing it than if you were in a completely dark room and there was a flash of light. That's just how your brain works. Okay, so I'm going to make a new one of these real quick. I'm not going to save that. All right, so let's go back to the 30 frames per second and what actually happens. On a good computer playing the same game, what happens between the 30 frames per second and the 60 frames per second to allow you to tell the difference and to make a direct comparison. Now people argue this and say, well, I can. Well, if you didn't follow the first time, I'm sorry for not doing a good enough job explaining it, but what you're actually noticing is it's slowing down. Not 30 frames per second, you're noticing a difference at 24 or less. The point is that you're noticing when it drops below 30 frames per second. And the reason that you can notice a difference on 60 frames per second is because when it slows down, is when it frames down. Like let's say that little bar wasn't there, and so then it slowed down in this area. And then in this area, when it crashes or when it dumps, it goes down to 30 frames per second. Okay? Whereas when this takes a crap, it goes down to 20 frames per second. That is what you're noticing. Okay, so you're noticing here that when it crashes down to 20 frames per second, you can notice that. When it crashes down to 30 frames per second, you do not notice that. And most of the time, the game, if your computer can run it at 60 frames per second, it's never going to crash as low as 30. So let's see, can I make this thing any bigger? I'm sure there's a way. Oh, size, here we go. That did a whole lot of nothing. When it crashes, though, it doesn't actually go down. Now, a 30 frame rate per game crashing down to 20 is pretty normal. But with 60, if your computer can run it at 60, more often than not, you're only crashing down to like 40, which once again is too much for your brain to recognize. So, if the game can maintain a solid frame rate of 30 without dropping down below 30, there's no reason for it to go any higher because your eyes can't tell the difference. Now, a big part of the argument comes whenever they say that the motion, right, like your cursor moving around the map, like let's pretend my little cursor here, is my crosshair, and I'm trying to like shoot all these different guys, like bam, 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 bam. And if it's only 30 frames per second, I notice it being choppy and moving. And if it's at 60 frames per second, it's all nice and smooth. But actually, that's not the case. I'm just going to get rid of my dots. When your computer is rendering a game and you're playing through it and you're doing a particular task, like looking at the floor, or maybe you're staring out of a tower and you're waiting for some action, well, the game doesn't have to call on any of its underlying systems, like the physics engines and all these various things that your computer has to process mid-action. So what happens is whenever you try to do something quick and fancy, like jump up and take a pot shot at somebody, or crouch, sprint, quick scope somebody, all of a sudden all these different systems that are built into the game come into play. And those systems tank your frame rate because of two things. One, because all of a sudden your system has to expend resources in different areas to render all these different things that are happening, and two, because you have to actually render different things on the screen. So any sort of video encoding, or the game actually rendering a video game, uses algorithms to compress the data and then display the data. For instance, if you're staring at a completely black wall, whether it be in a video game or a movie or whatever, the compression algorithms and the actual compression is very, very small. There's just not that much information to display. But whenever you're firing your gun or you're sprinting through an area, all of a sudden that amount of information is a lot more, which makes it much more complex, as well as having less resources because the resources are being devoted to these other underlying systems such as physics or gunplay, what have you. All of a sudden I'm trying to like sprint, jump, quick scope somebody. Frame rate crashes 5, 10, 15, 20, and then it goes right back to normal, right? Whereas if your computer is running it at 60 frames per second, or your Xbox or what have you, doesn't matter, or your PlayStation Vita maybe, I don't know. I wonder if those are any fun. Excuse me. It's where if it goes down and then it crashes. So you got 10, 20, 30, and oh no! I just tried to do some really complex maneuver and introduce a bunch of physics that my computer wasn't currently processing. It's only gonna cap down to like 40, which is not noticeable. So your mouse cursor stays smooth. Because over here, 20 frames per second is detectable by the human eye, and I don't think anybody's arguing that. So at 20 seconds per second, your mouse cursor gets all choppy. A choppy cursor. This is what they should teach in school now. Not handwriting, but how to write and paint. Choppy cursor. I mean, let's be honest. Nobody really does anything with their hands anymore. Wait. Yeah, they do. Nobody writes anything with their hands anymore. Okay. So choppy cursor, but at 40 frames per second, it's a smooth cursor. So people say that the action is much more fluid at 60 frames per second, but no, your action is much more smooth at 40, not at 60, because I promise you, no matter how good your computer is, whenever you introduce a lot of physics at the same time, the frame rate's going to go down. Now maybe it's a really badass computer, so instead of 40, maybe it just dropped down to 57, right? Maybe it just dropped down to 57. That's a maybe. We'll put it in a little thought bubble. Whoops. Oh well, you get the idea. Which is just as smooth, really, as the 40 frames per second, except, not really, because if your computer can handle, you know, the quick jump sprint, quick scope, at 57 frames per second, then it's not going to stutter on pretty much any aspect of the game. Whereas if your computer can't handle it, you're going to get the choppy cursor. And that's the problem that happens whenever they cap games at 30 frames per second. Now, in an ideal world, they would cap games at 30 frames per second, and it wouldn't go below that. Really, it shouldn't be a cap. It should be a minimum. And I think that's something that, man, I really wish I could get on the phone to like all the top developers in the world and be like, quit capping our frame rates. Let us have a minimal frame rate. A minimal frame rate of 30 frames per second. Like for the new Thief game, you know, they said that they're going to cap it at 30 frames per second, and that's fine, except you know that at any brief, you know, sudden action movement in the game, it's going to drop below 30 frames per second. So, like, I wish I could call those guys, and maybe I'll, you know, shoot them an email with this link that they'll ignore, and say, like, we don't need the cap at 30 frames per second. Put it as a minimal. You know, put the cap at 40, or put it at 35. It doesn't have to be a huge range, just so long as it can't go below 30 frames per second. Because that's whenever you have things like a choppy cursor, or stiff movement, or stuttering steps. Not because the cap rate is at 60, it's because whenever the 60 frames per second crashes, it doesn't go below 30. And if you think you can tell the difference, I'm sure I haven't convinced anybody really. You can't see more than 30 frames per second. And I can't think of a good way to prove that to you, right? Because that's something that's so fast that we can't actually prove, right? I can't hook up a sensor to your brain and then show you 30 frames per second and then show you 60 frames per second. Because anybody can lie. And people lie all the time. In case you were wondering about that little fact of life. But really though, that's the science behind it. And the truth is that you cannot see above 30 frames per second. Now maybe because we're humans, right, and we're all built differently, some of our brains work faster. Some of us are StarCraft 2 pro gamers, and their brains can probably register like 300 frames per second and tell the difference between 300 and 301, right? Because we're all human and things are different. So yes, I'm not saying absolutely nobody on the planet can tell the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second. I'm saying that most people. Just like, you know, there are people that can go swimming in the Arctic Ocean and be just fine. That's not most people. That's very few people. You know, it's like going to the Olympics, right? Very few people can do that stuff. Anyway, that's how it works. And man, I rack in my brain trying to think of a way to prove it to you, but I just can't. And like I said, you may be that one exception, you know, like that 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 1,000,000 people that can actually see the difference. But most people can't. And if you can see the difference, it's something that's very small and minute. It's like people that can see slightly farther than everybody else. You know, the difference is not huge, and it's not a big deal. And we need to have games have a minimal 30 frames per second. And we would save resources, and we would never know. In fact, the game developers just should never tell us, and they should disable any kind of FPS tracking in the game, and we would never know. We would never know. If you did watch, thank you for watching. I'm out.